The cottonwood trees stood skeletal against the bruised sky, their branches clawing at clouds that promised rain but never delivered. She watched them from the barn door, pitchfork in hand, counting the days since the last storm. 43. 43 days of dust and dying grass, of cattle lowing at empty troughs, of checking the creek bed only to find it drier than the day before. Her husband had been dead 8 months. Fever took him fast, left her with 300 acres of Colorado territory, a herd of longhorns she couldn't move alone, and a silence so deep it threatened to swallow her whole. The nearest settlement was 2 days' ride through country that didn't forgive mistakes. She'd learned to shoot straight, to read the sky, to trust her instincts more than promises. The barn needed repairs. The fence line sagged in a dozen places. Winter would come whether she was ready or not, and she still hadn't salted enough meat or stacked enough firewood. Every morning brought a list of tasks that stretched beyond sunset, and every night brought the weight of knowing she was one bad decision away from losing everything. Some days she wondered why she stayed. Why she didn't sell out and move back east where women didn't have to know which end of a rifle to point at wolves. Where loneliness came with the option of company, not just endless miles of empty prairie. But this land was hers. She'd buried a husband in it, poured sweat and blood into every acre. Leaving felt like betraying his memory, like admitting the West had beaten her. She was mucking the stalls when she heard it. Not the wind, not a coyote. Something else. Something that made the horses nervous, ears flat, nostrils flaring. She set down the pitchfork and reached for the rifle she kept propped near the door. Her boots crunched through dry hay as she moved toward the opening, every sense alive. The sound came again. A groan, low and pained, from somewhere past the corral. She stepped into the fading light, rifle raised, and that's when she saw him. A man, face down in the dirt, one hand clutching his side where blood had soaked through his shirt. His clothes were trail-worn leather and homespun, his hair long and matted with dust and sweat. She approached slowly, rifle never wavering. 20 feet away, she could see he wasn't moving much, just the shallow rise and fall of his back. Could be a trap. Could be bait for something worse. But as she circled around, she saw his face. Young, maybe 20 or so, with the dark features and beadwork that told her what he was before he ever opened his eyes. Cheyenne, most likely, or Arapaho. Out here, it didn't much matter which. What mattered was that he was bleeding out in her yard, and anyone who found him here would have questions she couldn't afford to answer. The territorial governor had made his position clear. Indians weren't welcome on white land unless they were dead or in chains. She should have walked away. Every practical bone in her body screamed at her to let nature take its course and bury him after. But something in the way he lay there, vulnerable and alone, reminded her of her husband in those final hours. That same helplessness, that same desperate grip on a life slipping away. She lowered the rifle and knelt beside him. His eyes fluttered open, dark and clouded with pain. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. She pressed her hand to his side, felt the hot wetness of blood still flowing. Not a knife wound. A bullet, and recent. Without thinking too hard about the choice, she slid her arms beneath him and lifted. He was heavier than she expected, all muscle and bone, but she'd spent 8 months hauling water and feed and fence posts. She carried him into the barn and laid him on a bed of clean hay in the back stall, away from the door. The wound was bad. The bullet had entered just below his ribs on the left side, and she couldn't tell if it had gone through or was still lodged inside. She'd tended animals before, even pulled a bullet from a horse once, but this was different. This was a man, and if she did this wrong, he'd die on her barn floor. She fetched water from the well, clean rags, a bottle of whiskey she'd been saving, and her sewing kit. Her hands trembled as she arranged her supplies. This wasn't just dangerous because he might die. This was dangerous because if anyone discovered what she was doing, she'd be tried as a traitor. Aiding the enemy, they'd call it. Consorting with savages. When she poured the whiskey into the wound, his whole body went rigid, but he didn't cry out. Just clenched his jaw so hard she thought his teeth might crack. She worked by lantern light, probing the wound with steady hands despite the fear coursing through her. The bullet was there, lodged against something solid. She dug it out with forceps meant for splinters, and when it finally came free, she nearly wept with relief. The bullet was military issue. She recognized the marking from when soldiers had passed through last spring. This man had been shot by the U.S. Army, which meant they'd be looking for him. Meant he was either a criminal or a warrior who'd fought back. Either way, keeping him alive made her complicit. She stitched him up with thread meant for saddle leather, each stitch careful and tight. His breathing steadied as she worked, and by the time she tied off the last knot, he'd passed out completely. She covered him with a horse blanket and sat back on her heels, suddenly exhausted. What had she done? Harboring a wounded Indian was as good as signing her own death warrant if the wrong people found out. The territorial militia had been through here twice in the last month, hunting renegades. They'd made it clear what happened to white folks who gave aid to the enemy. She'd heard stories about a family up north who'd been burned out for less. But as she looked at him lying there, unconscious and helpless, she couldn't summon regret. Only a deep, bone-tired resolve. She'd made her choice. Now she'd have to live with it. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the barn with her rifle across her knees, listening to him breathe, listening to the night sounds beyond the walls. Every creak of timber, every gust of wind made her jump. By the time dawn broke, she'd run through 100 scenarios, each one ending worse than the last. She checked his wound at first light. No fresh bleeding, no signs of infection yet. She brought water and managed to get some down his throat, though he barely stirred. His fever was climbing, and she knew the next few days would tell the story. Either the infection would take him, or he'd pull through. She'd done all she could. The work didn't stop for unexpected guests. She fed the horses, milked the cow, checked the fence line on the north pasture where the cattle liked to push through. Every task carried the weight of awareness now. She was harboring a secret that could get her killed. She found herself glancing toward the barn constantly, half expecting to see smoke rising from it, or soldiers pouring out. But everything remained quiet. Too quiet, almost. The kind of quiet that made her skin crawl. By midday, she saw riders on the horizon. 3 of them, moving slow and deliberate across the open ground. Her heart hammered as she watched them approach, trying to gauge their intent from their posture and pace. They could be passing through. They could be looking for him. She went inside the cabin and washed her hands, changed her shirt, tried to look like a woman who had nothing to hide. When they knocked, she opened the door with the rifle visible but not raised. The man in front was older, weathered, with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. The 2 behind him were younger, harder, with the look of men who enjoyed their work a little too much. "Morning, ma'am," the marshal said, touching his hat brim. "Name's Dalton. We're tracking a fugitive. Wounded Cheyenne warrior, shot during a raid on a supply wagon north of here. Trail leads this way." She kept her face neutral. "Haven't seen anyone. Been alone out here since my husband passed." Dalton nodded, sympathetic but not deterred. "Mind if we look around? Just to be thorough." She stepped aside, knowing refusal would only raise suspicion. They moved through the cabin with professional efficiency, checking under the bed, behind the curtains, in the root cellar. When they headed toward the barn, her pulse spiked. She followed them out, trying to keep her breathing steady. The younger men were rough, kicking at hay bales, stabbing pitchforks into piles of straw. The marshal walked through the stalls more carefully, poking at hay bales, peering into corners. She held her breath as he passed the back stall where the man lay hidden under layers of straw and blankets she'd arranged that morning. Dalton paused, sniffed the air. She smelled it too, faint but there. Blood and sweat and the herbal poultice she'd applied. The marshal's eyes narrowed, and for a terrible moment she thought he'd discovered everything. Then one of the horses whinnied, distracting him, and he moved on. "Looks clear," he said finally. "But if you see anyone, you let us know. Man's dangerous. Killed 2 soldiers during that raid." "I will," she said, knowing she wouldn't. Dalton turned back at the barn door. "You sure you're all right out here alone, ma'am? Lot of country between you and town. If that Indian's around, he might think a woman alone is easy pickings." "I can take care of myself," she said, lifting the rifle slightly. The marshal tipped his hat. "I'm sure you can. But just the same, might be wise to come into town for a spell. Till we catch him. I've got livestock to tend. Can't just leave." Dalton studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Suit yourself. But we'll be patrolling regular. Any trouble, you fire 3 shots and we'll come running." After they left, she stood in the barn doorway and watched them disappear over the ridge. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to set the rifle down. She'd lied to a federal marshal, and if he ever found out, she'd hang. She went to the back stall and pulled away the coverings. The wounded man's eyes were open, watching her. He'd been awake the whole time, she realized. Had heard everything. "Why?" His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. She didn't know how to answer that. "Because you were dying? Because I couldn't walk away? Because in 8 months of loneliness, she'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed?" "Seemed like the right thing," she said finally. He studied her for a long moment, then closed his eyes. "When I am strong, I will leave." "When you're strong," she agreed. But they both knew it would be longer than either of them hoped. The days blurred together after that. She tended him morning and night, changing bandages, forcing broth down his throat, watching for signs of infection. The fever broke on the 3rd day, and by the 5th, he was sitting up on his own. By the 7th, he insisted on standing, though his legs shook with the effort. She learned his name on the 8th day. He spoke it quietly, like offering a gift. She told him hers in return, and something shifted between them. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. He told her about the raid, how it wasn't what the marshal claimed. The supply wagon had been carrying rifles meant for the militia, guns that would be used to hunt his people. They'd attacked to survive, not for sport. 2 soldiers had died, yes, but so had 3 of his brothers. War didn't count casualties fairly. His voice grew rough when he talked about his brothers. One had been barely 16, eager to prove himself. Another had just become a father. The 3rd had been his closest friend since childhood. They'd bled out on the prairie while he'd crawled away, too wounded to help, too stubborn to die. She told him about her husband, about the fever that took him so fast she barely had time to say goodbye. How she'd held his hand through the final night, feeling him slip away degree by degree until there was nothing left but an empty shell. About the loneliness of this place, the way silence could become its own kind of death. She told him things she'd never said aloud. How sometimes she talked to her husband's grave like he could still hear her. How she'd catch herself setting 2 places at the table before remembering. How the nights were the worst, when the cabin felt too big and too empty and too full of ghosts. He listened without judgment, without the platitudes people offered when they didn't know what else to say. When she finished, he simply nodded and said, "Grief is the same in all languages." By the 2nd week, he was moving around the barn, helping where he could. He couldn't lift much yet, but he could mend tack, organize tools, keep her company while she worked. They developed a rhythm, a partnership born of necessity and unexpected compatibility. She taught him English words he didn't know. He taught her Cheyenne phrases, the sound strange and beautiful in her mouth. They laughed when she got the pronunciation wrong, and in those moments, she forgot what he was supposed to be. Forgot what she was risking. He was just a man, wounded and far from home, and she was just a woman trying to survive another day. He had a quiet sense of humor that surprised her. When she complained about a stubborn cow, he said in careful English, "Perhaps she knows you need practice with stubborn creatures." When she burned breakfast, he solemnly observed, "Even warriors fear your cooking." It was gentle teasing, the kind that came from affection rather than cruelty, and it made her smile more than she had in months. But the world outside didn't forget. On the 15th day, she rode into town for supplies. The general store was full of talk about increased patrols, about a reward posted for information on the wounded warrior. $500, enough to change a poor settler's life. She bought flour and salt and coffee with hands that didn't shake, made small talk with the storekeeper about the weather and the price of beef. The storekeeper's wife looked at her strangely, asked pointed questions about how she was managing alone, whether she'd seen anything unusual. "I see the same thing every day," she said. "Work that needs doing." On the ride home, she pushed her horse harder than she should have, suddenly desperate to get back, to make sure he was still there, still safe. The paranoia surprised her. When had he become something she couldn't bear to lose? He was in the barn when she returned, and the relief that washed over her was disproportionate to the brief separation. He looked up from the bridle he was mending and smiled, and something in her chest tightened. This was dangerous. Not just the harboring of a fugitive, but this feeling. This connection that had grown in the quiet spaces between them. She was a widow. He was Cheyenne. The world had no place for whatever this was becoming. That night, she lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to reason with herself. He would leave soon. He was almost healed. Another week, maybe 2, and he'd be strong enough to travel. He'd go back to his people, and she'd return to the solitude she'd known before. This was temporary. It had to be. But in the morning, when she found him outside splitting firewood despite her protests, when he grinned at her and said he needed to rebuild his strength, she knew she was lying to herself. This wasn't temporary. This was already something more. The third week brought complications. The wound had healed well, but he'd developed a cough, deep and rattling, that worried her. She made him rest, forced him to drink tea brewed from herbs she'd gathered, sat beside him when the coughing fits left him exhausted. In those moments, sitting close in the dim barn light, their hands sometimes touched. Brief contacts that lingered longer each time. She told herself it meant nothing, that proximity bred familiarity, but the way her heart raced at his touch betrayed the lie. One evening, as she tended the horses, he spoke from behind her. "You saved my life." She didn't turn around. Anyone would have done the same. "No," he said. "They would not. Most would have let me die. Or killed me themselves." She finally looked at him. His face was serious, beautiful in the fading light. "I'm not most people." "I know," he said softly. "That is why this is hard." She understood what he meant. This pull between them, this impossible thing. They both felt it. They both knew how it would end. She wanted to say something, to acknowledge what hung between them. But the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she turned back to the horses, brushing them with more force than necessary. He stood there a moment longer, then quietly left. That night, she didn't sleep well. She kept thinking about his words, about the careful distance they maintained, about how much harder it was getting to maintain it. She was falling for him. Had fallen, maybe, already. And there was nothing she could do about it. The fourth week brought visitors she hadn't expected. She was checking the fence line when she saw them. Not 3 riders this time. Not a patrol. This was different. A group of riders emerged from the tree line to the north, moving in formation. At least 15, maybe 20. All Cheyenne warriors, their horses painted, weapons visible. At their head rode an older man, his bearing proud, his face marked with the scars of a lifetime of battles. Terror seized her. They'd found him. They'd come for their warrior, and she was in their path. She rode hard back to the cabin, her mind racing. Should she hide him? Should she let him go? Would they kill her anyway for the weeks she'd kept him? She'd heard stories of what happened to settlers caught between Indians and the army. None of them ended well. He was waiting in the barn when she arrived, and one look at her face told him everything. They come. She nodded, breathless. 20 riders. Warriors. I think they're looking for you. His expression was unreadable. My father. Your father? He leads our band. He has been searching for me. She felt something collapse inside her. Of course. Of course he wasn't alone in the world. Of course people were looking for him. She'd been so focused on keeping him hidden from the white authorities that she'd never considered his own people would come. What do we do? She asked. We meet them, he said. Together. Are you sure? They might think I held you prisoner. Might think. He cut her off. They will know the truth. My father reads faces. He will see what you have done. They walked out to face the riders together. Her legs felt like water, but she kept her spine straight, her rifle at her side but not raised. He stood beside her, still favoring his wounded side but standing tall. She noticed he'd changed into traditional clothing she hadn't known he possessed, clothes he must have hidden in his pack. The warriors stopped 50 yards out. The older man in front dismounted and walked forward alone. His eyes swept over his son, taking in the healing wound, the borrowed clothes mixed with traditional garments, the white woman standing beside him. His face betrayed nothing. Words passed between them in Cheyenne, too fast for her to follow. The father's voice was firm, commanding. The son's was respectful but not submissive. She caught her name in the exchange, heard the tone shift from interrogation to something else. Surprise, maybe. Or respect. The conversation went on for several minutes. Other warriors dismounted, forming a semicircle but keeping their distance. She stood frozen, trying not to show fear, trying to look like a woman who regularly faced down war parties on her front lawn. Finally, the son turned to her. He tells the others what you did. That you saved me when you could have let me die. That you hid me from the soldiers. The father spoke again, this time slower, in broken English. You show courage. Honor. My son owes you life debt. She didn't know what to say. I did what anyone should do. The father shook his head. Not what anyone does. What few would. He gestured to the warriors behind him. They came prepared for war if we found him captured or dead. Instead, we find him alive. Healing. Because of you. One of the younger warriors dismounted and approached, carrying something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to the father, who unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a buffalo hide robe, intricately beaded, clearly valuable. The work was exquisite, thousands of tiny beads forming patterns that told stories she couldn't read. The father held it out to her. For you. Gift of gratitude. And promise of protection. Any who harm you, harm us. She took the robe with trembling hands. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever touched, soft and heavy, warm even in the afternoon heat. Thank you. The father nodded, then looked at his son. You come home now? The son hesitated, glanced at her, then back to his father. He spoke in Cheyenne again, a longer speech this time. The father listened, his expression grave, then nodded slowly. My son says he wishes to help you finish work before winter. You are alone. You need help. I say yes, but he must return before first snow. She looked at the son, her heart pounding. You want to stay? If you allow it, he said quietly. I owe you this debt. It wasn't just debt. They both knew it. But in front of 20 warriors and a father who just offered her protection, she couldn't say what she really felt. I could use the help, she managed. The father mounted his horse. We camp nearby. 3 days. Then we return north. My son knows where to find us when time comes. He paused, looking at her directly. You have my word. No harm comes to you while he is here. Or after. The warriors turned as one and rode back toward the tree line. She watched them go, the buffalo robe heavy in her arms, the weight of what had just happened settling over her. He stayed. The next months were the most content she'd known since before her husband's death. He worked beside her dawn to dusk, repairing fences, tending livestock, preparing for winter. He was stronger than any hired hand, more patient, more thorough. And in the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood, about learning to hunt and track and read the land. His father had been a strict teacher, demanding perfection, accepting no excuses. He'd learned to shoot before he could write, to track game before he learned to read the sky. He told her about his mother, who died when he was young, and how her loss had shaped him. How his father had raised him to be a warrior but also a man of honor. How the pressure to prove himself had driven him to volunteer for the raid that nearly killed him. About the guilt he carried for surviving when his brothers hadn't. How he woke sometimes in the night, hearing their voices, feeling the weight of their deaths on his shoulders. How he'd thought he wanted to die too, until she'd given him a reason to live. She told him about her life before Colorado, about growing up in a city back east where the streets were paved and the buildings tall. About meeting her husband at a church social, about the way he'd convinced her to come west with promises of adventure and land. She told him truths she'd never admitted before. That she'd loved her husband, but not with the kind of passion that made her heart race. It had been comfortable, safe, the kind of love built on companionship and shared goals. Not this. Not this feeling that consumed her whenever he was near. This awareness of every movement, every word, every glance. They hadn't touched beyond the necessary, hadn't spoken of what hung between them like smoke. But it was there, undeniable and growing stronger every day. They worked together with an ease that surprised her. He seemed to anticipate her needs, handing her tools before she asked, moving livestock before she had to direct him. She found herself doing the same, pouring coffee when she saw him pause, leaving food where he'd find it. It was domestic in a way that terrified her. Like they were building something that couldn't exist outside this bubble they'd created. Like they were pretending to be something they could never be. The first snow came in late November. She woke to find the world transformed, white and silent and beautiful. He stood on the porch, staring at the horizon, and she knew what he was thinking. Time was running out. She joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Cold today. Yes, he said. Soon it will be colder. They stood in silence, watching snow fall. Finally, he spoke again. I should go soon. Before roads are blocked. I know. But I do not want to leave. She looked at him then, really looked at him. His profile against the white landscape, strong and sad and beautiful. I don't want you to leave either. He turned to face her. This is impossible. You know this. I know. My people will not understand. Your people will not allow it. I know. He reached out slowly and touched her face, his hand warm against her cold cheek. But still I want it. She leaned into his touch, years of loneliness and grief and desperate need rising up all at once. Still I want it too. They stood like that for a long moment, the world reduced to the space between them. Then he pulled her close, and she went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and feeling his arms close around her. They held each other as snow fell around them, knowing this moment couldn't last, knowing they'd take it anyway. That night, he slept in the cabin for the first time. Not in her bed, not yet, but on a pallet by the fire. She lay awake in the next room, listening to him breathe, feeling the strange comfort of not being alone. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and found him already up, making breakfast. It became their routine. They worked together, ate together, talked long into the night by the firelight. The physical distance between them remained, but the emotional intimacy deepened. They were careful never to touch, never to cross that final line, but the wanting was there in every glance, every accidental brush of hands. She learned more about him in those weeks than she'd learned about her husband in years of marriage. His favorite foods, his childhood fears, his dreams for a future that seemed increasingly impossible. He wanted peace between their peoples. Wanted a world where children didn't grow up learning to hate. He learned her rhythms, her moods, the way she bit her lip when concentrating, the way she hummed while cooking. He learned to read her silences, to know when she needed company and when she needed space. He learned that she was stronger than she looked, braver than she believed, lonelier than she admitted. December brought bitter cold and hard decisions. One morning, he came in from checking the cattle with news. Storm coming. Big one. We need more firewood. They spent 2 days cutting and hauling, racing against the darkening sky. The work was brutal, and by the end of each day they were both exhausted. But they worked side by side, and there was something satisfying about it. Something that felt right. The storm hit on the third day, a howling blizzard that trapped them inside. Snow piled against the windows, wind shook the cabin walls, and the world disappeared into white chaos. They fed the fire and rationed food and waited. The close quarters made everything harder. She was aware of him constantly, of the way he moved through the small space, the sound of his voice, the warmth of his presence. On the second night of the storm, they sat by the fire and he told her about his wife. She died 2 winters ago, he said quietly. Sickness. I could not save her. The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd never considered he might have been married. I'm sorry. She was good woman. Strong. We were matched by our families, raised together. But we did not have this. He gestured between them. This fire. She understood what he meant. Comfort and compatibility, but not passion. Not this consuming need. My husband was kind, she said. Gentle. I cared for him. But I did not burn for him. I did not ache when he was gone from the room. And now? Now I burn, she whispered. Now I ache. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. So do I. They sat like that for hours, holding hands in the firelight, neither willing to let go. The touch was electric, every nerve in her body aware of where their skin met. When she finally slept, it was with her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. In the morning, they woke tangled together, and the line they'd been so careful not to cross had blurred. They looked at each other for a long moment, and she saw her own desire reflected in his eyes. The storm raged outside, giving them an excuse, a reason to stay close. But they both knew they were making a choice. A dangerous, possibly stupid, absolutely inevitable choice. He kissed her first, soft and questioning. She answered by pulling him closer, by opening her mouth to his, by letting months of restraint finally break. They moved slowly at first, almost tentatively, learning each other's bodies the way they'd learned each other's minds. The storm broke on the 4th day. They ventured outside to find a transformed landscape, snow drifted to the eaves, paths buried, the world pristine and impossible. They dug out together, laughing at the absurdity of it, throwing snow at each other like children. That night, something shifted. They didn't discuss it, didn't plan it. It simply happened. A kiss by the fire that turned into more. Clothes discarded, bodies pressed together, years of loneliness erased in the heat of connection. They made love slowly, carefully, learning each other's rhythms and responses. She'd never felt like this with her husband, this complete merging of bodies and souls. This sense of being known entirely and accepted completely. Afterward, they lay wrapped around each other and knew they'd crossed a threshold they couldn't uncross. The world outside still existed, still held all its dangers and prejudices. But for now, in this moment, they had each other. The weeks that followed were stolen time. They both knew it couldn't last, that winter would end and reality would intrude. But for now, they had this. Mornings waking together, days working side by side, nights wrapped in each other's arms. She'd never been happier. She'd also never been more terrified. Because happiness this intense had to be paid for, and she was afraid of what the cost would be. He taught her things her husband never had. How to read tracks in the snow, how to move silently through the forest, how to find food in the dead of winter. She taught him to read English, to write his name, to understand the words in her few precious books. They created their own world in that cabin, a world where skin color didn't matter, where cultural differences became fascinating rather than dividing. A world where love was possible between two people who had no business loving each other. But worlds like that can't last. Not when they're built in the middle of a war zone. January brought a thaw and with it, visitors. She saw the riders from a distance and knew immediately something was wrong. Not soldiers this time. Not his people. These were settlers from town, and they rode with purpose. She woke him and they dressed quickly, both understanding the danger. When the riders arrived, there were 7 of them, led by a man she recognized from the general store. His name was Garrett, and he owned the largest ranch in the territory. "Morning, ma'am," Garrett said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Heard you've got an Indian staying with you." Her blood ran cold. "He's been helping with winter work." "Just temporary." "Temporary's been 3 months, Garrett said. "People are talking. Asking questions. Why a widow woman's keeping company with a savage." "He's not a savage," she said, voice sharper than intended. "He's a man who saved my ranch from going under." Garrett's eyes flicked to him standing behind her. "That true, boy? You been playing ranch hand?" The son said nothing, but his hand moved to his knife. The settlers noticed, and several reached for their guns. "Easy now," Garrett said. "No need for trouble. We just came to suggest it's time for your guest to move along. Before people get the wrong idea about what's happening out here." "And what idea is that?" she demanded. Garrett's smile was thin and cruel. "You know what idea. White woman and an Indian. It ain't natural. It ain't right. And it ain't safe for you or anyone else in this territory." "He's leaving soon," she said. "When he's ready." "He's ready now," Garrett said. "Unless you want us to help him along." She felt him tense behind her, knew he was calculating odds, counting guns. She put a hand back, touching his arm, staying him. "Give us 1 day," she said. "He'll leave tomorrow." Garrett considered this, then nodded. 1 day. "After that, if he's still here, we'll come back with more men. And we won't be so polite." He leaned forward in his saddle. "And ma'am? Whatever you think is happening between you two, it ends badly. Always does. Best you remember that." They rode off, leaving a trail of threat hanging in the air. She turned to him and saw the anger in his eyes, the hurt. "You want me to leave?" "I want you to live," she said. "If you stay, they'll kill you. Maybe kill me too. Then we leave together." She shook her head, tears starting. "I can't. This is my land. My home. All I have left of my husband. I can't abandon it. And I cannot abandon my people," he said. "My father expects me back. I have responsibilities. Warriors who look to me for guidance. Family who needs me. They stood facing each other, the impossible distance between their worlds suddenly undeniable. They'd known this moment would come. They just hadn't prepared for how much it would hurt. That night, they didn't make love. They simply held each other, memorizing the feel of arms and breath and heartbeat. She traced the scars on his chest, the bullet wound she'd healed, trying to commit every detail to memory. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in, storing the sensation against future loneliness. They talked through the night, making promises they both knew they couldn't keep. That they'd find each other again somehow. That this wasn't really goodbye. That love like theirs didn't just end because the world said it had to. But in the gray light of dawn, they both knew the truth. This was goodbye. In the morning, she helped him pack. He took little, just some food, a blanket, the clothes he'd arrived in, now mended and clean. She wrapped bread and dried meat in cloth, filled a canteen with water, checked his supplies with the same careful attention she'd given to his wound months ago. Her hands didn't shake. She wouldn't allow them to. If this was their last morning together, she'd be strong. She'd give him that gift, at least. The gift of knowing she could survive without him, even if it was a lie. He moved slowly, methodically, as if delaying each small task might stop time. He checked his knife 3 times, refolded the blanket twice, adjusted the straps on his pack with unnecessary precision. Neither of them spoke much. What was left to say? At the door, he turned to her. I will not forget you. I will not forget you either. Will you marry again? Find another man? She shook her head. I've had 2 loves in my life. That's more than most get. Only 2? He asked quietly. She touched his face, feeling the warmth of his skin one last time. One was comfort. One was fire. Both were real. He kissed her then, long and deep and final. She tasted salt and realized one of them was crying. Maybe both. When he pulled away, his eyes were wet. If there is another life after this one, I will find you. Promise? Promise. She watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the white landscape until he disappeared entirely over the ridge. Then she went inside, sat by the fire they'd built together that morning, and wept for the life they couldn't have. The weeks that followed were agony. She threw herself into work, repairing what needed repair, tending what needed tending. But the cabin felt empty without him. The night stretched endless and cold. She'd wake reaching for him, her hand finding only empty space and cold sheets. Everything reminded her of him. The mended fence posts. The reorganized barn. The carefully stacked firewood. Even the way the horses responded to her now, gentler, because he'd taught her to move differently around them. She wore the bear claw necklace he'd made for her beneath her clothes, hidden from prying eyes but always against her skin. At night, she'd wrap herself in the buffalo robe his father had given her and pretend she could still smell him in the fibers. February brought another storm, and then another. She weathered them alone, the way she'd weathered everything before he came. But now solitude felt different. Before, it had been her armor. Now it was just loneliness. The townspeople watched her differently now. She felt their eyes when she came in for supplies, heard the whispers that stopped when she approached. The storekeeper's wife was particularly cold, making pointed comments about Christian values and the sanctity of civilization. She held her head high and ignored them. Let them think what they wanted. She knew the truth of what they'd shared, and their judgment couldn't touch it. In March, riders came again. This time it was Marshal Dalton, and he wasn't alone. Behind him rode a full contingent of soldiers, and at their head was a captain she didn't recognize. Her heart sank as they approached. This wasn't a friendly visit. "Ma'am," Dalton said, dismounting. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but we've had reports about you and a Cheyenne warrior. He left in January," she said flatly. Check the barn if you don't believe me. They did. They searched everywhere, questioned her extensively, tried to catch her in lies. She held firm, told the truth about his injury, his recovery, his departure. Left out the parts that mattered, the parts that were hers alone. The captain was less sympathetic than Dalton. A tall man with cold eyes and a clipped military bearing. He walked through her cabin like he owned it, touching her things, opening drawers, reading the spines of her books. You understand harboring an enemy combatant is treason, he said. I understand I saved a dying man, she replied. If that's treason, then I'm guilty. And the nature of your relationship with this man? Her spine stiffened. He worked my land in exchange for shelter. Nothing more. The captain's smile was unpleasant. Several witnesses claim otherwise. Claim they saw you together. That you were intimate. Then several witnesses are liars, she said coldly. Or perhaps they see what they want to see because it confirms their prejudices. Careful, ma'am. False testimony is also a crime. Then perhaps you should arrest those bearing false witness instead of harassing a widow trying to work her land. Dalton intervened, placing a hand on the captain's arm. We've seen enough. No evidence of wrongdoing. No Indian. No crime. The captain looked like he wanted to argue, but finally nodded. They mounted up, but before riding away, the captain turned back. You should know that Cheyenne warrior you claim to have helped. He's wanted for murder. If he comes back here, you report it immediately. Or you'll face charges as an accomplice. After they left, she sat on the porch and watched the horizon until the sun set. Part of her had hoped, irrationally, that he might come back. That he'd risk everything for one more day together. But he didn't come. Because he was smarter than that. Because he loved her enough to stay away. April brought wildflowers and with them, a letter. The mail rider brought it, eyeing her with suspicion before riding off. She opened it with shaking hands, recognizing nothing about the envelope or the handwriting. Inside was a single page, written in careful English. She recognized his handwriting from the lists they'd made together, planning for winter. I am well. My father understands. He says you are brave. He says if you ever need help, send word to the northern ridge. 3 fires, he will come. I think of you every day. I hope you are safe. I hope you know you changed me. Before you, I was a warrior. Now I am a man who knows love. That is a gift I will carry forever. There was no signature. No return address. But she held the letter to her chest and cried, grateful for the proof that she hadn't imagined it, that what they'd shared was real. She wrote back, knowing she'd never send it. Filled pages with everything she couldn't say when he was leaving, all the words that had caught in her throat. She told him about the empty cabin, about the way she still made coffee for 2 in the mornings. About the buffalo robe she slept under every night. About how she understood now that love didn't always mean having, sometimes it just meant knowing it had been real. She kept the letter in a drawer with his, tied with string. Sometimes, on particularly lonely nights, she'd read them both and remember. Summer came, and with it a decision. She rode into town and sold half her herd, used the money to hire 2 ranch hands. Big, quiet men who asked no questions and did good work. With their help, she fortified the property, built new fences, expanded the barn. She also started teaching. Word spread that she'd help any woman who needed it, teaching them to read, to shoot, to manage land. Women whose husbands had died, whose men had left, who wanted to learn how to survive alone. She became known for it, this strange widow woman who lived at the edge of the territory and helped others stand on their own feet. One of her students was a young woman whose husband had been killed in an Indian raid. The woman was bitter, full of hate for all natives. She came to learn to shoot, to protect herself, she said. Over weeks of lessons, the woman's story emerged. Her husband had been a drunk who beat her. The raid that killed him had actually saved her life, though she'd never admit it out loud. The Indians she hated had freed her from a private hell. She never told the woman about him. Never shared her own story. But she tried to plant seeds, to suggest that maybe the world wasn't as simple as we wanted it to be. That maybe people were more than the labels we gave them. Some students listened. Others didn't. But she kept teaching, kept trying, because he'd taught her that understanding could bridge impossible distances. That love could exist in the spaces between worlds. Years passed. She never married again. Men asked, occasionally, but she always refused. She'd meant what she told him. She'd had her two loves, and that was enough. Sometimes, in the evening, she'd see smoke signals from the northern ridge. Messages she couldn't read but knew somehow were meant for her. She'd build her own fire then, sending smoke back into the sky, a conversation without words. She wondered if he ever came close, if he watched from the hills while she worked her land. Part of her hoped he did. Part of her hoped he'd moved on, found happiness with someone his people would accept. Both parts of her ached with equal intensity. On the 5th anniversary of his departure, she woke to find something on her porch. A bundle wrapped in hide, with no note, no explanation. Her heart raced as she carried it inside and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a necklace of bear claws and turquoise, worked with incredible skill. The kind of work that took months to complete. Beneath it, a single eagle feather, bound with red thread. She wore the necklace every day after that, no longer caring what people thought. Let them see. Let them judge. This was hers, and no amount of disapproval could take it from her. And on quiet evenings, she'd hold the feather and remember. Remember the man who'd fallen into her yard wounded and alone. Remember the impossible thing they'd built in the face of a world that couldn't accept it. Remember the choice she'd made to save him, and how that choice had saved her too. She never saw him again. But sometimes, in dreams, she felt his arms around her. Heard his voice telling stories by the fire. Woke with the ghost of his kiss on her lips. The territory changed around her. More settlers came. More conflicts. More violence between whites and natives. She watched it all from her land, helping where she could, speaking up when others were silenced. She became known as an Indian sympathizer, a dangerous label, but one she wore with pride. Because she'd known one. Had loved one. And he'd been more honorable than most white men she'd met. In the summer of her 45th year, war came to the territory. A band of warriors attacked a settlement 20 miles south, and the army retaliated by hunting any Indian they could find. She heard stories of massacres, of women and children killed, of chiefs who sued for peace being executed anyway. She sent smoke signals north. 3 fires, like his father had said. For weeks, she saw nothing in return. Her anxiety grew with each passing day. Had they been caught in the violence? Had the army found them? Then, one morning, she woke to find her property surrounded. Not by settlers. Not by soldiers. By Cheyenne warriors, maybe 30 of them, with women and children among them. They were fleeing the army, she realized. Running for the mountains. She walked out to meet them. An older warrior dismounted and approached. She recognized him after a moment. One of the men who'd come with his father all those years ago, now grayed and scarred by time. He needs help, the warrior said simply, gesturing behind him. Her heart stopped. She pushed through the crowd and found him. Older now, his hair streaked with silver, a fresh wound across his ribs. But alive. He was alive. Their eyes met, and everything she'd tried to bury over the years came flooding back. He tried to speak, but she shook her head. Save your strength. She organized everything with the calm efficiency of a battlefield commander. The women and children went into the barn. The warriors created a perimeter. She brought water, bandages, supplies. And she worked on his wound the same way she had a decade ago, with steady hands and a racing heart. The warriors stayed 3 days. She fed them from her stores, gave them what supplies she could spare, pointed them toward safe passages through the mountains. The army was too close behind for them to stay longer. On the 3rd night, she sat with him by the fire while the others slept. His wound was healing well. He'd live to run again. "I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered. "I thought the same," he said. "When your fires came, I thought it was a dream." "It wasn't a dream." "No," he agreed. "But this is. These 3 days. This is a dream we get to have before waking." She understood what he meant. The world was still impossible. Still divided. They still couldn't have what they wanted. But they had this moment. This brief reprieve. They talked through the night, filling in the gaps of years apart. He'd become a peace chief, working to negotiate treaties, to prevent the wars that kept erupting. He'd married again, a political alliance to unite 2 bands. He had a daughter now, sleeping in her mother's arms in the barn. It should have hurt, hearing about his other life. But instead, she felt glad. Glad he'd had companionship, a family, a purpose. Glad he hadn't spent years alone the way she had. "And you?" he asked. "You never married?" She shook her head. "Some loves are too big to replace." He took her hand. "I know." They sat like that until dawn, holding hands like they had during that first blizzard. Not lovers anymore, but something deeper. 2 people who'd shared something sacred and impossible, who carried the memory like a talisman against the darkness. In the morning, the band prepared to leave. His wife approached her, a beautiful woman with kind eyes and their daughter on her hip. She spoke in Cheyenne, and he translated. "She thanks you for your help. She says she knows what you were to me. What I was to you. She says there is no jealousy because she understands some bonds transcend time." The woman held out a small beaded bag. Inside were seeds. Native plants that would grow in this soil, that would remind her of them. She accepted with tears in her eyes. "Tell her thank you. Tell her she has a good man." The woman smiled, and for a moment, the 3 of them stood there in perfect understanding. Then his wife withdrew, giving them a moment of privacy. At the edge of her property, the band mounted up. He was the last to climb onto his horse, moving carefully around his healing ribs. He looked down at her one final time. "Thank you," he said. "For everything." "Come back if you can," she replied. "You'll always be safe here." "I know," he said. "That is why this place lives in my heart." Then they were gone, disappearing into the mountains, ghosts fleeing the dawn. She stood at the edge of her land and watched until they vanished. Then she went inside, planted the seeds in her garden, and returned to the life she'd built. But something had shifted. She'd seen him again, and it had given her a strange kind of peace. A sense of completion. They'd both survived. Both built lives. Both carried the memory of what they'd shared, and it had shaped them into better people. More years passed. The wars intensified, then gradually subsided. Treaties were signed and broken and signed again. The territory became a state. The frontier slowly civilized, though never entirely tamed. She grew old on that land. Her hair turned white. Her hands grew weathered. The ranch prospered under her stewardship, became known as a place of safety, of tolerance, of unexpected kindness. Women came to her for help, and she taught them not just survival, but resilience. Not just how to shoot, but when not to. Not just how to defend their land, but how to make peace with their neighbors, even the ones who looked different. She became a kind of legend in the territory. The widow who'd outlasted everyone, who'd built something lasting from grief and courage. People told stories about her, some true, some embellished. But the true story, the one that mattered most, she kept to herself. When she was very old, too weak to work the land anymore, she sat on her porch one final time and looked north toward the ridge. Smoke rose there, thicker than usual, in patterns that meant something she couldn't quite translate. But she understood anyway. It was a goodbye. She closed her eyes, the bear claw necklace heavy against her chest, the buffalo robe wrapped around her shoulders. And in that moment between waking and sleeping, she felt him there beside her. Felt his hand take hers. Heard his voice, unchanged by time. "I told you I would find you." She smiled. "You always keep your promises. Are you ready?" "I've been ready since you left." And together, they walked into the light. Her students found her the next morning, peaceful on her porch, a slight smile on her weathered face. They buried her on her land, beneath the cottonwoods, with the bear claw necklace and the eagle feather, things that belonged to her alone. Years later, when her cabin became a museum, when people came to learn about the remarkable woman who'd lived there, they found letters hidden in a drawer. 2 letters, tied with string. One in English, one in Cheyenne, each telling the same story from different sides. And people began to understand that the legend they'd heard wasn't complete. That beneath the story of the tough frontier woman was another story. A love story that crossed boundaries thought impossible. A romance that had shaped not just 2 lives, but everyone they touched. The cabin still stands today, a testament to courage and choice. And sometimes, visitors swear they see smoke signals on the northern ridge, answered by smoke from the valley below. A conversation that never ended, just translated into something beyond words. Because some loves are too powerful to be contained by a single lifetime. Some bonds transcend the divisions we create. And sometimes, in the vast and lonely spaces of the West, 2 impossible people found each other and changed the world, one small choice at a time.